welcome to Hard Talk.
Thanks very much. Good to be here. Thanks.
Why did you make that decision to stay in Gaza when so many foreigners who lived there decided to pull out?
Well, you know, you have to think about the story in relation to the dangers, and I always felt very strongly that Gaza was a story worth telling. I saw it as being very much central to the whole Palestinian drama, which in turn is central to much of the wider conflict at the moment you see between the East and the West. I thought it was a story worth telling, worth staying to tell. Set against that, there were obvious dangers. I'd seen perhaps more than 20 foreigners kidnapped, aid workers and journalists and so on, but there was a limit to the danger. This wasn't Iraq. Everybody, all the foreigners had been let go within 10, 13, 14 days at the very most, and none of them had been killed. None of them had even been beaten around, and that level of threat I felt really wasn't quite enough to force me and the BBC to pull out of Gaza. I thought that the threat, if you like, was manageable, and I guess I was wrong in that when I did get taken, the game had rather changed, and I was in big trouble.
When you were picked up on the street, very close to your office, you were bundled into a car, driven with a sack over your head through Gaza's neighborhoods, you knew, didn't you, from the very beginning, that this was this was a hostage taking. You had become the story.
Absolutely. You know, I'd rehearsed in my mind so many times what it would be like to be taken in Gaza. There were so few foreigners there, and it was often journalists that did get taken. I would have been crazy not to prepare myself really for that moment, and I'd thought through many times what it might be like at that moment of ambush. Every few weeks there'd be some minor incident on the road, a gunman getting quickly out of a car, and I'd wonder, is this it? And then on the 12th of March, it was indeed it. This car pulled up in front of me, a young guy with a pistol out immediately, and at that moment I knew that my time had come, basically.
See, I'm trying to imagine those first few hours when you're bundled out of the car, you're taken to some grimy apartment, you don't know where, somewhere in Gaza. That, in a way, is when you're at your most vulnerable, I would imagine, because that's when the shock is at its most intense. Did you, at that point, panic?
You know, as I say, I had almost rehearsed that moment as many times as I could.
You can't rehearse for the reality of it, can you?
Yeah, but in that moment when I did get taken, the truth is I wasn't panicking. I did manage to hold on to a degree of calm. I was frightened, but I really wasn't panicking, and I was almost at that early stage, somehow watching myself and checking, are you hanging on to yourself really mentally? And the truth is that I was, and I just feel that was partly because I was kind of mentally prepared for it. I'd prepared for it so many times. I felt that I'd almost done it before. I was almost saying to myself, this is it, this is what it feels like. And it does indeed feel something like I always imagined it would. And the atmosphere in the car wasn't violent. I was immediately stripped of everything in my pockets. They were pulling money out of my pockets as if I'd just been to the bank, actually, and it was like they'd hit a jackpot, you know, and off came my phones and my passport. And although I was asked, they were asking me, are you British, are you British? And one of them said, are you a spy? And I said, no, I'm just a journalist. And then even in that journey, at one point, one of them said, don't worry, the only word of English I'd heard, and that was a relief, and I really wasn't panicking at that moment.
Interesting that they chose to say don't worry, and in the early hours, I think within the first 24 hours of capture, the leader of this gang came to you and said, you will get through this, we are not going to kill you.
Absolutely. This seminal moment in the whole thing, sometime after midnight, suddenly I'm woken, the door unlocks, the door swings open, and its frame was filled by this huge figure in a long white robe, and he had this red and white check headscarf wrapped around his head, and he came in and sat down. I kind of knew at that moment that somehow this was the jihadi group, and he did say right off the bat there that this is about Muslims being held in Britain, and it turned out later also in Jordan. And in the course of that conversation there was moments, flashes of some small anger at times in him, but mostly almost kindly. And you're right, he did say then, you won't be killed, you'll be treated in the way Muslims are supposed to treat their prisoners, and that came as a huge relief. And he said, he made clear that at some point I would go. I asked him when, and he said just when the time is right. But I was left with this profound sense that it would be protracted and life-changing. And what was really important too is that you're sitting there talking to a masked man in the dark in a kidnap hideout, and you just wonder, can you trust him in any way? Is he really the leader of this group, and might he change his mind? And you're just filled with uncertainty, hoping that what you've heard is true, and worrying too that it's going to be very protracted.
As you became accustomed to these men over the weeks that followed, did you believe they were human beings capable of killing you?
I felt that they were always unlikely to kill me, to be honest. I didn't see quite what mileage there would be in that. I always felt I was more used to them alive than dead. But there was one particular day when the guards suddenly came in with a set of manacles and chained me with my hands and wrists and feet, and shut the window and put off the light, and you're there in the dark and the heat, and he did say, we're very angry and we are thinking of killing you. And he told me how it would be done with a knife on the throat and cutting the throat and so on. And at that point you had to believe that there was a possibility. I still didn't think, even at that stage, that it would make sense for them to do that, but you had to believe that there was a possibility. They were ready to talk like that, and you had to believe that maybe they were prepared to act like that.
From the beginning of this interview, you've described how you tried to keep control. Control's an important word for you. Did you keep control even then, when he's sort of doing these gestures and talking about Zarqawi, and presumably in your mind there are images of Ken Bigley or Daniel Pearl and others who have suffered that sort of fate?
When I look back on the whole kidnap experience, it was more than anything a huge psychological battle, an effort, as I kept on seeing it, to keep my mind in the right place. And God knows I wasn't always winning that battle. There were passages of depression very often, times when I felt I was edging towards despair, but there was always, I always knew I had to make the fight, I had to hang on, and it seemed even more important at times of the greatest danger that I should wage that battle to try to keep control. And I felt that there was only one thing that I might be able to control. I might be able to control in the whole experience. Everything else was out of my hand, but I might be able to control my state of mind, and I did battle to try to do that. I wasn't always successful by any means, but that was always the nature of the fight. And when at the most serious moments, like the time when they said that they might kill me, it seemed even more important to try to hang on to your state of mind at that point. And I guess many people would do that in different ways, but I felt that at that moment when I might be killed, if the worst happened, then it would be on camera, it would be the last thing my parents and the world would see of me, and all I had to throw at that thought was that I must try to hold myself together if I possibly could. I didn't want the last image of me to be a weeping, broken man, and God knows I might have looked like that if it had come to the worst, but I did try to plan to be calm, and I lay there thinking about how I might manage to control myself at that point if it came to it.
Even as I